know the drill, but just in case you don't, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the MICTAC CTAC website. The PowerPoint presentation is already available, and you can see the link, I believe, and the link will be on our website as well, and we'll provide that to you. But again, the PowerPoint is available. The recording will be available, I believe, in a day or so. And also, just to mention for those folks, we will be encouraging everybody to submit their questions throughout this presentation. It's actually office hours. We will be doing part of it as a presentation because we have gotten numerous questions already. So we want to kind of kick off this presentation with those questions, but we're also looking forward to additional questions you might have. This is a follow-up to the series that we have just recently conducted on documentation. And again, so if you are submitting those questions, please use the chat box feature, and please use that throughout the presentation as we will be collecting and answering those towards the end. And with that, I will turn this over to David Eckert, who's going to take you guys through the presentation and also the Q&A. Dave, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Boris. That was Boris Vilgorin from the McSilver Institute, NYU. Good afternoon. I'm David Eckert from CCSI, and welcome to Office Hours. This is our wrap-up presentation where we're going to cover questions and key material that we have covered in this documentation series. So, to talk about who we are, we make sure that the slides are forwarding as we need them to. So who is MICTAC? It's a combined effort of the McSilver Institute, also, of course, MICTAC and CTAC, the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, and Community Technical Assistance Center of New York, as well as CASA, the Center on Addiction and Substance Use. Other partners include CCSI, I myself, Dave Eckert again from CCSI, NIAPRIS, ICL, and the IDEAS folks. Again, Boris is partnering with us from the McSilver Institute. So a little bit more about MICTAC and CTAC. The Community Technical Assistance Center of New York and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center of New York are training, consultation, and educational resource centers serving all behavioral health agencies in New York State. We help agencies strengthen their clinical and business infrastructure through training opportunities focused on implementing evidence-based practices and addressing the challenges associated with the recent changes in regulations, financing, and overall healthcare reforms. So as everyone knows, we have a rapidly changing healthcare environment. MICTAC and CTAC and all of our partners are here to help you as you adjust to those reforms to deliver evidence-based and financially viable practices. At the end of this, we're going to take some time to give you a brief tour of the website, and any questions can be directed to mictac.info@nyu.edu. So please feel free to let us know any needs and questions that you have. As we get started here, we have a few poll questions for you, just to get a backdrop of where we are as we initiate this presentation relative to what is most descriptive of your role. So tell us who you are and what your role is in the agency you're with, and a little bit about your understanding of the resources and support available through CTAC and MICTAC, and also a bit about if you've begun utilizing the information and or resources gained in this webinar series. So tell us a little bit about that. We'll let you weigh in on those questions and get right into the content in just a second. All right, we're winding down with those submissions. Thank you for taking the time to do that. And as we complete this webinar today, please stay on and answer the post questions as well. We find that information extremely useful to our planning efforts. All right, as we continue here, past topics we've covered in this documentation series include advice from managed care companies. That was our first webinar. Then we led into using kind of a tracer methodology, thinking of how clients move through care. We talked about the foundations of quality documentation, what's common across all elements of documentation that needs to be present. Then what needs to be in assessments and justifying the need for treatment, into treatment and recovery planning. Then we did a webinar on progress note writing, and the last one prior to this was the role of supervision and supervisors in supporting all of that work. So today in this office hours presentation, we're going to review the purpose of the documentation series, again briefly, what we've hoped to accomplish, and we want to review the frequently asked questions that have come up, some that we've answered already but are definitely worth reiterating because we see a lot of common themes to these questions that have come up, and we want to make sure we're answering that. So we've separated the questions into topic areas, first being regulatory and managed care compliance, then clinical best practice, which I'll point out, of course, has a lot to do with regulatory and managed care compliance. There's a ton of overlap, of course, between best practice and that, but what goes beyond regulations and managed care guidance and is also considered clinical best practice. We'll cover questions related to that. The role of supervision and the use of tools and resources to make sure everyone has those understood as a takeaway. So we're going to review these areas of emphasis, answer these key questions that have come up, and again, make sure that you're aware as we move forward what resources are available to you and how we can best help you meet the needs to keep up with today's changing healthcare environment. So what do we consider under the documentation umbrella? The basic elements like assessment tools, treatment service plan, progress notes, also progress and monitoring tools that we incorporate in the medical record, such as surveys and evidence-based instruments, and also all notes to other providers. In an integrated care environment, we're documenting our collateral work with other healthcare providers, social services, probation, parole, etc. All of that is incorporated in effective documentation, and we've spoken to all of that in this series. So let's move on to talk about regulatory and managed care guidance, those key points and questions that have come up. And this slide is meant to represent regulatory and managed care guidance as the framework for all documentation. Regulations and managed care guidance isn't intended to be the be-all and end-all and all-inclusive of what needs to be in documentation. Rather, it starts with the essentials. And again, it is that framework of what needs to be included as a foundation to be effective in your documentation. So a bit of a disclaimer here first. Because the folks on this webinar series have been across all agencies and program types, it has not been possible for us to have guidance that covers regulations for all program types. So we really encourage you, strongly encourage you to refer to the regulations for your program that specifically apply to the service that you're providing. Your compliance with these regulations depends on your internal review, and really ultimately you as the provider are responsible for your clinical documentation. So through this webinar series, we've intended to provide general guidance that really is best practice and give you the best information available currently as to how to document, but it is not a substitute for knowing your regulations. So again, we do try to be as current as possible, but also we live in a rapidly changing world and things might change. So as you refer back to some of this information, really know what's most current regarding the regulatory expectations of your particular program and environment. So getting to the major points we've covered, Through every piece of the webinar series, we've talked about medical necessity and the golden thread that runs through documentation. So, medical necessity, talking a little bit more about that, we really want to note that it requires an appropriately qualified practitioner, and one must have the credentials to provide the service. All services provided are based on an approved diagnosis and assessed need. That is the cornerstone of medical necessity, where you have a diagnosis, you have the symptoms that support that diagnosis. Because of those symptoms, we have needs or functional deficits. That is what we direct our interventions at, to address those needs and reduce those functional deficits to help people move forward with their plans. And the interventions are prescribed in the treatment plan. Again, we want to improve functioning or prevent worsening for those that have been at higher levels of care, but we also want to always note, what are we working on now? What is the progress that's expected for this person? And we do that in a person-centered way. So the golden thread that runs through documentation incorporates medical necessity throughout. The record should tell a clear story and present a narrative that holds together through the assessment, the formulation at the end of the assessment, which is a springboard for the service planning and the progress notes. So those needs, that diagnosis, those symptoms, and what you're addressing make sense throughout the entire plan. And the services you're providing also reflect person-centered care and what the person really wants to gain from those services. That's where the golden thread comes to life, is when it makes sense in collaboration with those individuals. So those key themes we've emphasized throughout this series. We had a very good question that came up about what about medical necessity for clients that are stable, and we're helping them to maintain that stability as part of treatment. Well, it's important to document the history and document the need for treatment that helps them avoid risk, relapse, and the need for higher levels of care. But we also have to define the current goals and objectives. In addition to being stable, what is it about treatment that that person is working on now? What are the current goals and objectives? And if there aren't any, if it's simply stability, it would be helpful to explore other levels of care, other options like community support, support groups, self-help, etc. Now, quite commonly, especially in the mental health world, we see clients that are on medications and the primary care provider is not in a position to prescribe those medications for whatever reason, and we need to do that in the most cost-effective and efficient way to keep them in care, to keep the medications present. But we should document what else are they working on now to move toward objectives, and the efforts to link them to the least intrusive, the greatest level of individualized functioning that they're capable of. Treatment is always about needing less paid supports and moving toward community supports. We had good questions about clients who don't share symptoms. So how do we get that thread of medical necessity if we're not getting a clear picture from the client? And that was broken out in these questions to two basic areas. For SMI clients, clients with serious mental illness and difficulty articulating those symptoms, and also mandated clients. So let's speak to both of those for a second. With a client with serious and persistent mental illness, they may not be able to really clearly articulate what they're in treatment for and what they're working on. It's important to get input from collaterals and get the history. Of course, we need appropriate consent to get that input, but piece together the history of what we're working with them on now. Treatment really may be more about what are the social supports rather than symptoms. So how are we getting the supports around them, and our objectives relate to getting those supports in place to promote safety, to promote insight, and to increase their motivation, etc. Now, for mandated clients, there is, by regulation, generally speaking, a need for people to actively and voluntarily participate in care. And for folks that may be mandated to treatment Maybe their motivation is to satisfy the concerns of probation and parole. That is fine. That's motivation. That can account for a goal and what they want to get out of treatment, appropriately so. But also, if we're not getting active participation in treatment, we need to, in a very motivational interviewing kind of way, meeting them where they're at and understanding that ambivalence comes with change, talk to them about the change process and what they hope to gain from this. So, different approaches for depending on what people are presenting, but either way, we do need to substantiate the medical necessity of services for folks coming through care. We also have a time frame for documentation. This question came up a lot. Typically, under the Center for Medicaid and Medicaid Services, CMS regulations, they use the word contemporaneously, meaning about at the same time services are provided, documentation needs to be completed. Now again, refer to your regulations, but this is often interpreted as within 1 to 2 business days of when the service was provided. So waiting to complete notes, memory is imperfect, notes become more inaccurate over time, and also it's not compliant if you're waiting to do your notes. It is a CMS regulation, and managed care, Medicaid managed care, applies these regulations to their oversight. We had a question about backdating documentation. First, as a rule, documentation needs to reflect the date that it is written. So please don't backdate documentation. It can look fraudulent, so be careful. Document the date you wrote the date you did the service and did the documentation. But if you have technical difficulties that lead to a need to redo documentation, you should include both the date the initial documentation was completed as well as the date it was fixed. So best to be transparent about this, that the service was provided on this date and it was fixed on this date. But as a rule, please don't backdate documentation. Have it reflect the date it is written. Other questions about progress notes, which are a formal part of the medical record, versus private notes, those notes we write to ourselves, often called psychotherapy notes. Are they a part of the record? Now, progress notes are a formal part of the medical record, but the other notes we write, little stickets we put on the chart, etc., and separate notes that we may take in session, still need to be protected from view for unauthorized persons. They do not need to be a part of the formal record, but if they contain any PHI, of course, HIPAA rules apply, and they need to be protected from view for unauthorized persons, but they don't need to be in the formal record. We had another question about what do you mean to refer to documentation that becomes too strengths-based? Well, of course we want to document strengths, but we also have to remember medical necessity and that golden thread. So we should document the strengths, but include the symptoms and functional deficits that we're addressing that substantiate the need for treatment and what we're doing to address those needs and reduce those deficits. If you're so strength-based that that gets left out of your documentation, then again, you're missing medical necessity. So include strengths, but also include what about treatment you're doing to help the person move toward their recovery goals. Another good question came up. If a problem is not in the treatment plan, so you haven't really contracted for it in the treatment plan, which is the contract for treatment signed by the client, do you have to revise the treatment plan immediately? Well, no, not necessarily. If you have time, you can do a treatment plan review immediately, but a typical and accepted practice is to document the new focus. Let's say there was a new event or some crisis that came up that couldn't have been in the plan and wasn't in the plan, put it in your progress notes and then revise it at the next point of your treatment plan review. That is an acceptable practice, and it becomes a part of the medical record through the progress note. We had another question related to electronic signatures. Do they meet the points of compliance? Well, typically when a medical record system is set up, it's done in collaboration with the compliance team and the IT folks to ensure that these standards are met. And the electronic signature does substitute for an actual signature, what we would have done with paper. So it's important that these compliance and technical points are met so that the signature is considered to be in compliance. What about compliance points and electronic templates? This question came up that if the points are already addressed in your templates, like the start time, the end time, the duration of the session, the service type, if those roll over in your electronic medical record, do you need to rewrite them? Well, first you should ensure that that information is accurate. If it's not accurate, you need to change it. But if it's present and if it's accurate, you don't need to rewrite it or replicate it. You simply can sign it, which says you've approved its accuracy. Another question came up. If you have a mother and child in one session, can you bill for both? No, you really shouldn't do that. We would say don't do that. One person is the primary person that the session is for, so who was the session scheduled for? And then you can have a collateral session, bill it as a collateral session for that person you're providing the service for. But you can't really double dip. You can't have two people in session that would be both open in the clinic and then bill for both for one session. That would be an inappropriate practice. What about if multiple goals and objectives are covered in the session, can you just pick one and document that? Well, you really should make sure that every goal and objective covered in a session is tied back to the treatment plan so that you're consistent with the golden thread. But you really shouldn't forget or not include other things that you've discussed in session that relate back to that treatment plan. So it is regulatory practice to summarize all of the goals and objectives you've covered in the session, to do it succinctly and to cover all of those. Don't leave any of it out. We want the record to be succinct yet comprehensive. If a client takes medications regularly, do psychiatric visits have to be in the treatment plan? So this question was basically, the person stable on medications, does it still have to be part of the plan? Yes, absolutely, because again, that treatment plan is your contract for services. That's why clients sign it. So every intervention you're providing should be in that contract, or you're missing part of what you're doing. So absolutely include it, even if it's going well, especially when it's going well. So if it's something you're providing, it has to be in the plan, has to be reflected in your notes. We had a good question about practices for documenting group notes. And typically how this is done is there's a general statement about what was covered in the group, and then each client in the group will have an individualized note that meets the standards of medical necessity for that client. Again, it ties back to their plan where the group would have been prescribed in that plan. You would have objectives around what the client hopes to achieve in that group, and you've individualized your note for that person participating in the group based on their individualized plan. If you have one generic note, it really won't be person-centered, and we want to capture for each person participating in the group what they're there for and what they're getting out of it. So, tying up the Medicaid regulations, et cetera, and the guidance we get from managed care and moving toward clinical best practice, again, I will say that there's a ton of overlap, of course, between what is best practice and what is regulatory. So these build on how we're applying regulatory guidance and what else we do that's considered best practice. So a big part of this documentation series has really implored people to avoid cookie-cutter documentation. We want to reflect person-centered collaboration and beware of cut-and-paste shortcuts. They're often inaccurate, they often leave out detail, and that client's individualized voice that should come out in their plan is often missing when we cut and paste. So beware of that. It's okay to have standardized introductory statements, for example, in progress notes, but even progress notes for the same client need to be individualized. You know, as a consultant, I've done a lot of record review, and it's pretty easy to tell when cut and paste is overused and progress notes look almost identical over time. Well, as someone who's auditing the chart, who's looking at it, it really doesn't look like much progress is being made, and it doesn't look individualized when it's an obvious cut and paste. So the templates that are out there now allow you to individualize, include all the points of medical necessity, but let that client voice ring through in your documentation. So I'm aware that time is a valuable resource, but it's important to take the time to individualize and to collaborate with our clients. What about use of abbreviations? Well, it's important to ask yourself the question, would an objective external reviewer know what you mean by those abbreviations if the record were audited? Often these abbreviations seem quite localized if you're referring to local hospitals or providers, etc., and someone might not know who you're referring to or what they do. So think in terms of the documentation being audited or perhaps even subpoenaed at some point. Would they know what you're documenting if you're using abbreviations? So if you're overusing abbreviations, if they're not going to know what you intend to mean when you're using them. And another question came up, and this is a good one. How do we refer to ourselves in documenting in clinical documentation? As therapist, as provider, as writer, etc. The important point here, the takeaway is it needs to be clear who the author is and to include their credentials, of course, as a regulatory and compliance standard, but how you refer to yourself is often more stylistic. So there's not a regulation as to how you refer to yourself. It should just be clear who's writing the note and that it's signed off appropriately. Another good question, if client wants information left out of the record or a collateral wants to provide information but to give it anonymously, how do you proceed? Important to note that key information needs to be included in the medical record. However, you can do so in general terms. So you can refer to the person providing information as a family member, as a friend. There's not a regulatory point that says they have to be named. But information needs to be included in the record. Now, it should be included in a way so that if you are asked about it as the person doing the documentation, it opens up that file in your mind so that you can say more about why you documented that, what was intended, etc. But please include key information in the record. Just be ready to expound upon it if you're asked about it later or by somebody else working with that client. More about best practices and documentation specifics. We got some good questions about how do you document client behavior, whether they seem angry, oppositional, depressed, delusional, etc. As you hear those terms, there's some judgment inherent in those. So it's important to note as evidenced by and then objectively document the behavior that you're seeing. So if someone is angry, as evidenced by what? Elevated voice, etc. If they're oppositional, if they're depressed, are they looking away? Are they checking their phone or their watch in session? Objective behavior that says what you're seeing. Looking down, looking slumped shoulders, etc. Seeming depressed. So how do you observe? How do you objectively document observable behaviors? And then a question about curse words. Do we document those? I would ask yourself, is it essential to document that curse word to convey what they were intending? Is it essential to quote them when they're cursing? So maybe that's the best way they were making their point, and you would want to capture that. Often, though, it's not important, it's not essential to include a curse word, especially if you're documenting observable behavior, and it conveys the same meaning. Another good question, calling a client and they're not answering, should we document that? it is a best practice to document all attempts at contact. Because think about it, that is an intervention when you're calling the client and attempting to contact them, especially if they've missed appointments and you're trying to promote engagement, etc. So it's a good practice that you begin typing your note while the phone is ringing, and you can complete your note based on the content of the conversation. If they don't answer, you can document they don't answer. If they do answer, you can document the basics as to what the conversation was about. So it's really best practice to document all attempts, all contacts, all attempts at contact. So should a service or an intervention be included in a treatment plan when it hasn't begun yet? Yes. If it's been planned and if it's expected to occur within the time frame referenced in your recovery plan or in the client's treatment plan, you should include it. Remember, that's the contract for treatment. You expect it to occur, so put it in the plan. We had another question about prescriber intervention, the physician add-on services and therapy sessions. How do we document those? This is a very good and very specific question. So document each intervention separately in the progress note and have both people sign the note. So, also play therapy sessions. We recommend a SOAP format where you're documenting the subjective, objective, assessment, and plan information. So you'll have the slides and you'll be able to refer back to those for specifics. This also fits nicely in the NISCRI format. And the following slides here, we've included this is really a takeaway from the supervisory checklist that we can provide to all participants that are available to you. So the assessments and all of the bullet points here are included on those checklists. So these next few slides, here are the points included in an assessment related to demographic information, diagnosis, etc., also including stage of change, etc., and that the assessment is written and signed within regulatory time frames, is easy to comprehend, has acceptable spelling and grammar. So what these slides do here is summarize those checklists. Now we're moving into the one for treatment planning. So handy for clinicians to use, to self-check, and for supervisors to use as checklists to make sure that these points are included. And we really want to emphasize, when it comes to service plans, that objectives are realistic, understandable, measurable, behavioral, and achievable. In our service planning webinar, this was a very key point, to write objectives that can be achieved and reflect this acronym here. Again, realistic, understandable, measurable, behavioral, and achievable. We want clients achieving their objectives. And then again, more about written and regulatory timeframes, etc., easy to comprehend. And then the checklist for progress notes is included here as well. It talks about the compliance points of medical necessity. They're all here, again, summarizing those checklists and including person-centered practices and also elements related to the client's phase of change. A bit about the role of supervision now. Supervisor as coach here, that we really want to make sure that we are spending a lot of time reviewing documentation and supervision. It was a key finding that about half of our time should be spent with our supervisees actively looking at documentation. It's a key part of that conversation, is looking at what's getting documented. And how do you help those that are struggling? We'll help them practice writing or revising documentation. And remember that poor documentation can leave you vulnerable in an audit. We had a question about folks with English as a second language. Well, we want to make sure the standards of medical necessity are met regardless of comfort with language, that hopefully these folks are getting enough coaching to be able to meet the standards of medical necessity. Documentation can be basic and straightforward, but we want to make sure those points of compliance are met. So we had quite a few questions about how do you balance being succinct with being comprehensive enough to capture those key elements. So it's important to include enough detail so that the documentation meets the standards of medical necessity, but then cues you to recall essential content. So it is about practice as well to strike that balance effectively. And more about the role of supervisor. It's more than monitoring. It's about motivating, correcting, shaping, encouraging, recognizing efforts, and really helping people see that documentation reflects quality services. If the documentation is quality, it's quite likely that the services will be high quality as well. And we want providers to self-regulate. We also want supervisors to self-regulate, and for there to be a parallel process there that it's a constructive relationship between supervisor and supervisee that really builds towards people doing better with documentation over time, which again translates to better treatment over time. Tools and resources here. So what we've emphasized and what we have available, the treatment planning book we've referred to consistently is Treatment Planning for Person-Centered Care, Shared Decision Making for Whole Health, the second edition by Neil Adams and Diane Greeter, an excellent text here which provides great examples. We've also really want to encourage you to look at the New York State Clinical Record Initiative, the third version, NSCRI 3, and here's a link to those materials. And also links to regulations. It also includes, in addition to templates, links to regulations and guidance, documentation templates around assessments, addenda things like health assessments, etc., treatment plans and progress notes, and it also has great materials on workflows for procedures and services, so it can be really used from a service management and administrative managerial kind of perspective as well. And we have the CTEC and MCTEC website, which offers you excellent resources, and based on the number of questions we have here today, we'd like maybe able to give you a tour of that website. And also, additionally, we're going to, before we go on to answer, well, let's get these poll questions, or let's see what questions we have from the audience first before we move on to the poll questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Dave. And actually, before we even get there, we did get one comment from John, who's actually runs the NICE-Screen as part of OMH, and he wanted for us to share, which I think is ties in nicely to this presentation, that NICE-Screen will be offering a documentation demo specifically using the NICE-Screen templates. It will be led by Dr. Derek Jones, and it's on Monday, March 13th. So just wanted to convey that as well, and it kind of works nicely as well. So please note that. And we do have a couple of questions that came in, and we will encourage folks to submit other questions through the chat. So Dave, I'm not sure, do you have access to the questions?
Yep, we're putting them up right now.
Okay. Well, while we do that, I have them in front of me, so maybe I can just, so there was one question, maybe Dave, you can answer, that says, what does TPR stand for?
Oh, sorry, TPR stands for Treatment Plan Review. So the point after you've written the initial treatment plan, the point you're reviewing clients' progress with them, called either the TPR Treatment Plan Review or the Service Plan Review.
Excellent, thank you. We have another, yeah, go ahead, John, or Dave.
So we have what are case managers and or peers reporting in terms of additional time it takes to document in the EHR? That's a very good question. I think we get a theme when it comes to documentation of it being a time-consuming process to do well. And I would say that that is true, and whenever possible, in a person-centered collaborative approach, I think it's very acceptable, even a very good practice, to do documentation with those people we're providing services for and with. It engages them more effectively in the care. Research on collaborative documentation shows that it improves outcomes and actually reduces lengths of stay. So one of the ways to address this is to do it with the clients to make sure the documentation accurately reflects their needs, accurately reflects their progress, et cetera, and really lays the process open in a transparent way that lets them know what's being written about the book that is their recovery, the story of their recovery. So we do hear that it's time-consuming, but it's time well spent. And I would encourage you as a best practice to collaborate with your clients and to do documentation with them whenever possible. Who will audit children's care management, OMH or DOH, and health homes? That's a very good question, and I don't want to misspeak here. And as we offered a caveat at the beginning of this presentation, the guidance may change over time, but it's my understanding that at least with one local health home, we're encouraging care management agencies to monitor their own charts first. But I believe that ultimately that will be under the DOH umbrella. Boris, any other thoughts about that?
Right. So I think the way you said it is perfect. I think folks need to talk to their lead health homes and work with the state officials. This presentation in our webinar is focused solely on the behavioral health services. I think a lot of concepts definitely cross over to probably all healthcare or most of the healthcare and probably can be utilized in health home, but I just wanted to underscore that our focus and our expertise is in the behavioral health arena here. And so I just want to also add that disclaimer because health homes have specific requirements in addition and specific approaches, and want to make sure that folks really be in touch with their health homes and with the state entities that they work with.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Question, if the supervisee documents incorrectly and the note is saved, how do you address and document that? Very good question, and I think it's a good practice to do an addenda note that is attached to, that references the note that is incorrectly documented and saved, that revises it. And so any auditor would know that the notes tie together and that the corrected note, if you will, again, including just use the date you're writing the corrected note, but refer back to the original note and document that you're revising it to correct that. That's not an uncommon thing to have happen. We are imperfect creatures, and often we do need to do a correction. Just make sure they're tied together so somebody reviewing the documentation sees how the correction is tied to the original note. We had a question related to field workers, care managers. It's very difficult to do the required documentation in a thorough and efficient manner. Any ideas? You know, I think this is a good point, and I feel for you as someone who worked in the field for 22 years. It is challenging to get every aspect of the job done and to get it done well. It does require practice. I know that's not a great answer. I don't think there are any shortcuts, but I do think it is about learning to use the tools most effectively, also balancing a need to be succinct while you're covering all of the points of compliance. In my travels, have seen a lot of documentation that, quite frankly, provides a lot of information that doesn't have to be there. Through the golden thread, it should tie back to the plan and what was provided and give you enough information to individualize that note. But I've often seen people writing so much that it's more about exactly what was said and exactly, it almost looks like a transcript of a conversation rather than a documentation of a service. So I would encourage people to work with effective supervision on how to be succinct, yet capture the compliance points. And it is something that takes practice. So here's a question. Knowing that clinicians aren't perfect, should we err on missing an intervention or including one that we wind up not doing? Okay, good question. I think remember that if you're including an intervention, if you're expecting an intervention to happen within the time frame of the treatment plan, include it. However, if you've started a new intervention, it is possible to revise that plan at the point you've included a new intervention so that that contract for treatment reflects what you're doing. So keep it as current as possible and include what you're doing in the plan, in the note, and make sure that your most current treatment plan reflects all the services that you're providing.
Right. Dave, yeah, I would just add to it and echo what you just said. I think, one way I have seen folks approach the treatment plan, and a lot of folks use this term, it's a prescription. And just like when you get a prescription for medication, when you go to the pharmacy to fill that prescription, well, actually these days everything is electronic, so anyway, but you're going to get what was on the prescription and what the doctor prescribed, and you're not going to get additional medication just because you asked for it or the pharmacist feels it'll be good for you, especially if it requires prescription. And so I think, sometimes approaching the treatment plan as in a similar way, that if it's not in the treatment plan and it's not prescribed, who made the decision for a particular intervention or service to occur, what's the thinking behind, the logic behind it, and how does it help the individual to improve, becomes all of those questions. So I think it's important to kind of approach it that way.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we have a few minutes here to do, we have another question that came in. Okay, we have only 45-minute sessions, and we're doing play therapy or art therapy. There is often not time to document with the client. Documenting with clients seems more appropriate when seeing adults. Any ideas about how to do this during the session under these circumstances? Well, that's a really good point. As someone who worked with children and families in my career, one thing that I did was wrap up the end of a session with the child and included the parents and did the documentation with them together in the last 10 minutes or so of the session, at least to capture what we're working on, what we saw, and where we go next. And again, that SOAP format can be utilized. The other thing about concurrent or documentation, doing it at the same time, not to be confused with collaborative documentation, which is really more also about being person-centered, but making sure the client's voice is in there, is to collaborate. You don't have to do it with the person in the room. You just have to make sure their voice is very evident in the record. That you can't do it every time. So it may not be possible, if you choose to keep your play therapy or art therapy session a full 45 minutes with the child. That's absolutely fine, but you may have to do your documentation after that session. So it won't work all the time for all clients. Okay. And that's the last of our questions. We have a few minutes to do a quick tour of the CTAC MCTAC site. So I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn Teeter here, and she's going to give you a tour of the MCTAC site and highlight some of the key areas and resources that you'll find at that site. Also, while that's coming up, I want to make sure we're giving credit to all of our great partners in this webinar series. It's been a pleasure to team up with you and to do this documentation series with you. I think people have given this really a lot of effort and really put themselves into it, and thank you so much for doing that. And in the future, we'll be sending out a survey, and we hope to hear back from you in terms of what your needs are beyond this series and how can we be most helpful to you as we continue to move through this environment together. So please take a minute to respond to that survey so that we can best meet your needs. And Jocelyn, tell us about the MCTAC and CTAC website, please.
Hi folks, I know a lot of you are still getting used to the new website, so we just thought we'd do a quick little run through. Your two favorite headings are probably going to be upcoming events and trainings, and you'll see here I'm at the page where I already posted the slides, so all you have to do is hit download, and you're going to see the slides, and then you can save them as a PDF if you'd like. This is also going to be found, so when you click on the trainings heading, you're going to see recent trainings. So as of tomorrow morning, today's training will now be the first one listed. When you go all the way down, you'll see this fun little search box. You can, choose a training keyword. So if you were to choose documentation, which let me just find it here, hit apply. Sometimes I've been in this site a lot, but sometimes you'll get a little box that pops up. It just asks for your agency name, your email. We like to keep track of, who is looking at our materials. But you'll see all of the documentation-related presentations here, so you just have to choose the tile that you're interested in, click it. Oh, here's the pop-up box. So you can enter your name. I'll put my name. Mine just auto-populates now. And you'll see you can watch the recording and download the slides. Some of the trainings do have additional tools, so you will see additional buttons here. So you'll see some of the documentation checklist that Dave created on the last webinar attached to that. So there'll be multiple buttons. And the other feature is upcoming events, which has our calendar. And the great thing about the calendar is that everything stays, it will never go away. So even when you can't register for an event anymore because it's in the past, you can still click on it, and what we're doing is when you click View More Details, it will link right to the training. So you can download the slides and then listen and view the recording from the previous event that maybe you missed or you came late to or whatnot. So these are two really great areas to become familiar with. And we are still including, from previous years, and I kid you not, years, all of the trainings and recordings. So that's been divvied up, but they're definitely doing a great job of getting all the old trainings up and online and being able to search it using this calendar function. You can, look between in-person and webinars by the categories, which we'll call the institutes. So, business best practices, professional development, so you can really choose to see what you would like. So thank you so much for joining us. And if you have additional questions, please, feel free to chat to us. Send us an email to the MCTAC email, mctac.info or ctac.info@nyu.edu. There are a few of us that manage that, and we're always trying to answer your questions and give you help as fast as we can. And today's recording will be posted probably by tomorrow. Usually that takes just a little bit longer, but other than that, thanks so much to our presenters. And if you do have additional questions on the website and navigating and looking for anything, just shoot us an email.
Great, and thank you, Jocelyn and Dave. This was great, and thanks for everybody for joining and being with us through this series. Hope this was helpful, and look forward to the next set of series and next presentations.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Everybody. All right. Take care.